Hello everyone, Miss Goolsby here. Today we're going to cover Chapter 2 in your Phlebotomy Essentials textbook. This is entitled Quality Assurance and Legal Issues in Healthcare. The objectives for this chapter are to demonstrate basic knowledge of terminology for national organizations, agencies, and regulations that support quality assurance in healthcare, to define quality and performance improvement measurements as they relate to phlebotomy, describe the components of a quality assurance or QA program, and identify areas in phlebotomy subject to quality control or QC, as you might hear. Demonstrate knowledge of the legal aspects associated with phlebotomy procedures by defining legal terminology and describing situations that may have legal ramifications as a phlebotomist. And lastly, demonstrate knowledge of confidentiality and how to handle personal information according to regulations such as HIPAA that we learned about in Chapter 1. So we will start out with quality assurance in healthcare. Quality is the degree of excellence of something. Quality assurance in healthcare includes all the activities and programs put in place to guarantee the excellence of patient care. Quality assurance is a continuous process that aims to identify quality problems and establish criteria and standards to address them. Quality assessment involves data collection and analysis to determine if the criteria and standards are being met. A system put in place to improve quality by continuous monitoring and analyzing all processes and identifying those processes that need improvement is called continuous quality improvement, or CQI. Some national standard organizations and regulatory agencies. I'm sure that all of you have at least heard the name Joint Commission before. It is one of the key players to bring the quality assessment that I was just talking about to healthcare. The Joint Commission, or TJC, is the oldest and largest standard-setting body in healthcare in the United States. It is an independent, nonprofit organization that establishes standards for the operation of hospitals and other health-related facilities and services, and accredits and certifies these organizations. If you are certified and accredited by the Joint Commission, then you receive a gold seal of approval. To get this seal of approval, you must undergo and pass an on-site evaluation by a survey team at least every 3 years, every 2 years for the laboratory portion. Program-specific criteria that focus on quality care and patient safety are used in these evaluations and on-site surveys. The criteria for the clinical lab incorporate activities intended to reduce analytical error by improving the pre-analytical and post-analytical processes and more oversight of point-of-care testing. Pre-analytical is where we as phlebotomists come into play, because pre is before the analysis. So that is where we are drawing the samples before they get to the lab to be analyzed. Okay, so this is where it is very important. Most errors that happen with this particular situation come from misidentifying the patients. So this is where, as a phlebotomist, it is extremely important. I cannot stress that enough, how important it is for you to properly identify the correct patient. If you draw a patient that is not the one on the barcode, and that tube is sent back to the lab and those results are ran, then that instrument doesn't know that's not that patient. So they are going to turn out the results on the patient that it's not that person. So then what do you think is going to happen? the doctor's going to treat the patient that the label's on, and what if nothing's wrong with them? Or what if something totally different's wrong with them? Or what if the patient who really had something wrong never gets treated because then they get a sample that's normal from somebody else? So you see how this is huge issues. What is the purpose of healthcare? To get patients better. So if we are not getting the correct patient and label matched up and drawn, then we're the complete problem. They're not getting to the issue because from step one, they are not getting the right samples. So they want to improve this pre-analytical, and then post-analytical means after the testing. And point of care testing, we discussed this a little bit in chapter 1 too. This is where the more phlebotomists are in some settings doing more point of care testing, which means an example that you might be familiar with would be glucose bedside testing, where you take the little small point of care analyzer to the patient's bedside, you prick their finger, you put it in the analyzer at the bedside, and then the results are automatically put into the computer system. So nothing goes back to the lab, it's done at the bedside. So all of this has to be monitored for quality control and quality assurance to make sure that whoever's running these tests are doing it properly. Okay, the method that Joint Commission uses to identify these risk levels and these deficiencies during these surveys is called the Survey Analysis for Evaluating Risk. That is abbreviated SAFER. The intent of SAFER is to help healthcare organizations, or HCOs, prioritize and focus their corrective actions by giving them a visual representation of the survey results. So SAFER gives you on-site post-survey tools called the SAFER matrix that illustrates the likelihood of harm to a patient, a visitor, or staff that is due to an area of non-compliance. Okay, so the likelihood of harm with that deficiency is rated low, which means rare, but could happen, or it's rated moderate, which means it could occasionally happen, or it's rated high, which means it could happen at any time. So the requirements for improving these factors are due in a 60-day evidence of standards compliance, which is ESCs. So you have 60 days to give evidence that you are going to be compliant once they come and do this. Current standards stress performance improvement by requiring the facility to be directly accountable to the customer, which is the patients. This means that every department in that facility needs to be aware of the expectations, concerns, and compliance of patients and their families as well as employees. A report of a complaint or concern may be submitted online by email, fax, or mail, or by even calling a toll-free number. So if someone calls in a report, then it is submitted to the Joint Commission, and they review any past reports and the organization's most recent accreditation decision. So depending on the nature of that reported concern, the Joint Commission will then request a written response from the organization. They will incorporate the concern into a quality monitoring database that is used to identify these trends in performance. They will conduct an on-site, also notice unannounced. They don't have to tell you when they're coming for this. They will conduct an on-site unannounced assessment of that hospital. If that report raises serious concerns about a continuing threat to patient safety or failure to comply with these standards, and they will review the reported concern and compliance at the next accreditation survey. One of the ways Joint Commission demonstrates its commitment to safety is through its Sentinel. Sentinel is like an early warning event policy. The intent of this policy is to help identify safety issues and take steps to prevent them from happening again. A Sentinel event is any unfavorable event that is unexpected and results in death or serious physical or psychological injury. Such an event signals the need for immediate investigation and response. If a Sentinel event occurs, the healthcare organization is required to perform a thorough and credible analysis of the root cause, why that happened, develop an action plan immediately, implement improvements in practice to reduce that risk, and monitor improvements to determine if they are effective. The Joint Commission's National Patient Safety Goals, which are abbreviated NPSGs program, is part of the overall requirements for accreditation that promote and enforce these changes that are related to patient safety. They have specific requirements for protecting patients, and it plays a role in significant advancement of quality care. Criteria to determine and revise the goals are their cost, their effectiveness, and their impact on patient care. The 2023 NPSGs for clinical lab are listed below. Identify patients correctly. This means, and you need to take notes on this, identify them by using at least 2 ways to identify your patients. For example, you can use the patient's name and date of birth. One thing you definitely need to make note of, though, is the patient's room number or physical location absolutely cannot be used as an identifier. Why is that? Because let's say the patient was in room 213, but they decided to move the patient to 215. Well, if they moved that patient into 215, but they just moved Judy out of 215, then how do you know that they moved that new patient in? You don't. So you don't know that that patient is not going to be moved or that they didn't just get moved. You cannot use their location or their room number for this reason. Also, identify and label all blood containers and other specimens in the presence of the patient. Again, I can't stress this enough. Don't assume that you are going to remember, if you're in a hurry, don't assume you're going to remember that you put John Hughes specimens in your left coat pocket, but you're going to label them later. And then you're going to put Susie Q's specimens in your right pocket and label them later, because you won't, or you may get confused. Or what if you mislabel them? It's a very high possibility. Don't get in such a hurry ever that you don't label the specimens right there at the bedside of the patient. As soon as you draw their tubes, take the labels that are identified with that patient and label all of those tubes before you ever leave that patient's room. Okay, the next one is improve staff communication. This means getting important test results to the right staff person on the right time. This is so the patient can be treated properly and promptly. And lastly, to prevent infection, use the hand cleaning guidelines from the CDC and World Health Organization. Compliance means that hand hygiene guidelines reduce transmission of infectious agents by the staff to the patients and decrease incidences of healthcare associated infections. Briefly, to tell you what a healthcare associated infection is if your patient, for example, came to the hospital with, let's say, needing their gallbladder removed, and then while they're there, somehow they end up with a staph infection. Okay, then they're going to investigate. Where did they get this staph infection from? Did this staph infection come with the patient? No. So this means they got this while in the hospital. So this is a healthcare associated infection, okay? You came with something, you left, or you are there and you get something else. That's an infection you get while you're there. Okay, let's talk about CLIA. CLIA stands for Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments of 1988. That's why it's CLIA 88. These are federal regulations passed by Congress and administered by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. They establish quality standards that apply to all facilities, including clinics, physician office labs, anything that tests human specimens. The standards address quality assurance, quality control, proficiency testing, laboratory records, and personnel qualifications. The aim of the standards is to ensure the accuracy, consistency, and reliability of patient test results, regardless of the location, type, or size of the lab. To assist in administering these regulations, they have the CLIA Laboratory Improvement Advisory Committee, or CLIAC. This was formed to help. The purpose was to provide technical and scientific advice and guidance to the right people in the CMS who actually administer these regulations. All laboratory facilities subject to CLIA 88 regulations are required to obtain a certificate from the CMS according to the complexity of testing performed. You need to know that there are 3 levels of complexity, 3 categories. You have waived. Waived means they are simple and have a low risk of error. An example of a waived test would be like a pregnancy test you can get at Walmart. Okay? You actually don't have very little room for error, because what does it say? It just says yes or no, positive or negative. Okay? You don't do anything different. You actually use urine on the stick, whether you dip it or you actually urinate on the stick. Then you wait whatever amount of time, and it just shows you the results. So as a human, there's very little we can do to mess that up unless we don't have enough urine on the stick. Okay, so this means this is waived testing. Okay, so you don't have to actually be a MLT or an MLS or med tech. You don't have to have a degree in lab to do waived testing. So depending on where you go to work, as a phlebotomist, they can let you do waived testing, okay? Because you don't have to have this higher level of a degree to do this. The next, I need to tell you this. So if that lab can only do waived testing, then they have to apply for a certificate of waiver, or COW, okay? That's the waive testing. Let me tell you about the other 2. So moderate or higher complexity level testing means that their facilities are subject to routine inspections. So if your lab only does waive testing, then you do that certificate of waiver and you don't have these routine inspections for the lab part. If you do moderate or higher level complexity testing, then you will have these routine inspections, okay? So these on-site visits are known to the lab in advance, and what they are intended for is education and gathering information, okay? So they're to help these labs in order to get them, make sure that that testing is being done properly. If you look on that last bullet there, it says good lab practices for waive test. One of the educational tools that the Clinical Lab Improvement Advisory Committee made was, this is for the CLIA the WAVE test, okay, the Certificate of Waiver Labs. This is called the Good Laboratory Practices, or GLPs. This means there's 10 recommendations that emphasize quality assurance in collecting and performing blood work using waived testing kits. So I want you to look on page 50 in your book. This is box 2-1. Okay, this is a list of the 10 good laboratory practices. I'm going to run over these really quickly because these are practices that you need to be familiar with. Number 1, keep a current product insert. Okay, this means your lab testing kit box needs to have the package insert with it. Okay, it needs to be available to lab personnel, including you if you're doing the wave testing. You need to be able to have that product insert. It needs to be a recent current insert, and you need to be able to open it up and follow the instructions. Number 2, follow the manufacturer's instructions for specimen collection and handling. So you're going to look on this kit and see how they want you to collect that specimen. Number 3, properly identify the patient. That's never going to go away because that's the most important thing. If you don't have the right patient, then none of this matters. Number 4, label the patient's specimen for testing with an identifier unique to each patient. Number 5, inform the patient of any test preparation, if they need to be fasting, if they need a clean catch urine, whatever it is they've got. If they have to do any kind of preparation, the patient, then you need to let them know this. Number 6, read the product insert before. If you're in your textbook, underline the word before performing the test. Don't automatically think that you know what you're going to do. Because what if you collect the sample and you've already been there with the patient? Then you go back to the lab to do this test. Then you open the product insert and that's not the sample you need. What are you going to have to do? You got to go back in the patient's room and say, I'm sorry, I'm going to need a different sample. So don't read it afterwards. Read it before you go in there to make sure you get the right sample. Number 7, follow the storage requirements for the test kit. If that kit is supposed to be kept in the refrigerator and it's been on that lab shelf for 3 weeks, it's no longer valid, okay? If it can't not be stored properly, you can't use it. Also, when you open one, it changes the expiration date, okay? So write the new expiration date on the kit. Number 8, do not mix components of different kits. If you have one that's about to not have any test cartridges, and then you open up a new one, but you still got some reagent from the old one, don't save it. Don't mix it. Don't change those up. The reason being, you don't know if the quality control that was done on these kits varied a little bit. That's going to mess up your kit from one kit to the next. Number 9, record the patient's test results in the proper place, such as the patient's chart or lab test log. Very important here. Do not write them on unidentified sticky notes or pieces of scrap paper that can be thrown away or misplaced. Don't get in such a hurry that you don't just go ahead and write it down where it needs to be. And lastly, number 10, perform the instrument maintenance as directed by the manufacturer. Now, some of these test kits you use, they're not going to have an instrument, okay? They're going to be like the pregnancy test at Walmart. You're going to have a little test cartridge. You're going to do something to it, and then you're going to just read it. But if it requires an instrument for you to put that cartridge in an instrument, then you're going to have to do maintenance on that little instrument if maintenance has not been done since you've been at work or however it's routinely done. Some maintenance on instruments is done once a shift. Some it's once a day. So you're going to have to follow the maintenance log of whatever that instrument is you're using. Okay, let's talk about CAP. If you've never heard of this, you will hear of it because CAP, that abbreviation is heard all over the lab. Okay, what that stands for is the College of American Pathologists. This is another agency like CLIA that influences quality care through standards in the lab and phlebotomy. It offers proficiency testing and a continuous form of laboratory inspection by a team made up of pathologists and laboratory professionals. The CAP inspection and accreditation program does not compete with Joint Commission accreditation because CAP is designed for pathology laboratory services only. CAP is not for the entire hospital. It's only for the lab. So a CAP certified lab also meets Medicare and Medicaid standards because Joint Commission grants this mutual exchange of privileges to CAP in the area of lab inspection. Okay, if you're in your book still on page 50, on the key point at the bottom of the page, you can see where it says the CAP requires labs to have a competency assessment program to ensure that employees are performing lab tests and associated functions according to laboratory procedures and that records of employee competencies are kept on file. So when you first start a job as a lab professional, they will make sure that you're competent before you're turned loose in certain areas. Now, if you are in the waived testing phlebotomy type situation, this does not normally apply to you as far as any kind of CLIA wave testing, but they do want to make sure that you are properly doing this wave testing. So you will have to be checked off, but you are not quite as much a part of the CAP portion. Okay, CLSI, another abbreviation. This stands for Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute. This is a global nonprofit standards developing organization with representatives from the professional, industry, and government. It uses an agreement process to develop voluntary guidelines and standards for all areas of the laboratory. Phlebotomy program approval, certification exam questions, and the standard of care are based on these guidelines and standards. NACLS, this is another abbreviation. This is the National Accrediting Agency for Clinical Laboratory Sciences. This is recognized by the Department of Education as an authority on quality clinical laboratory education. The NACLS approval process for phlebotomy programs requires that the program meets educational standards called competencies designed to improve student outcomes and maintain quality education. So basically what they do is they oversee educational programs in phlebotomy and lab to make sure that the schools are following the standards that are national standards so that those students are getting a quality education and they're getting taught what you have to teach them to be able to take the national boards and be successful. Okay, and a last abbreviation is ISO. This is the International Organization for Standardization. This is an independent, non-governmental organization that has experts from all over the world. ISO standards are tools that businesses can use to ensure that their products and services are safe, reliable, and of good quality. Quality assurance in phlebotomy. As members of the healthcare team, you as phlebotomists must understand the significance of your role in providing quality patient care. Doctors depend on these test results to be accurate, and not only accurate but timely. If they're not performed correctly, pre-analytical, which I told you before was before they're analyzed, factors like patient preparation, specimen collection procedures, and specimen handling, that can affect the quality of the specimen. And in turn, that affects how valid that test result is. So where do these factors fall? Most pre-analytical factors fall underneath us, underneath you as a phlebotomist. So to ensure consistent quality specimen collection and handling, this is based on specific guidelines like those we just talked about with Joint Commission, CAP, CLIA, and CLSI. So you as a phlebotomist need to be very professional, very knowledgeable about these different agencies, and strictly adhere to those guidelines. Quality assurance processes. If your program or your hospital has a quality assurance program, which they will, they have these reviews that they look at to see how the process is working. Okay, any process that fails results in errors, and then this means they have to go through what they call a process improvement technique, and that's what PI stands for. This process improvement technique identifies problems or inadequacies and helps you as an organization to make a change to prevent these errors. So always striving to be the best. Some strategies and tools for improving this quality include failure modes and effects analysis. That's what stands for FMEA. 6 Sigma, lean, and root cause analysis are also explained in the box on page 51, box 22. We are going to briefly, if you've got your book, turn to page 51. I'm going to very quickly and briefly, because I don't want you to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I want to explain briefly these processes. So FMEA, which is failure modes and effects analysis, you need to just know what this means. It asks these questions. What could go wrong? What did go wrong? And what could be the outcome if it did? If something went wrong, what would happen? Would this kill a patient? Would this harm a patient? Would nothing happen? Okay, so what could go wrong? What did go wrong? And what would be the outcome if it did? Okay, let's talk about lean. Lean aims to improve patient safety by eliminating waste in the form of unnecessary processes. So it strives to make every employee a problem solver. Steps in this method depend on investigating errors and improving quality and preventing similar errors. 6 Sigma. Okay, this evaluates pre-analytical and post-analytical processes, minimizing and eliminating waste. The Lean 6 Sigma. This is a combination of Lean and 6 Sigma. RCA, which is root cause analysis. These are formalized investigations and problem-solving approaches used after an event or problem has occurred. Okay, this is required by the Joint Commission. So this means you're trying to identify the trend and understand how it happened, why it's happening. Quality indicators. One of the most important aspects of setting up a quality assurance identification process is establishing quality indicators to monitor. For the lab, that means there must be indicators that monitor pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical processes. An indicator is defined as a measurement or value that provides information on what something is like, such as the state or level of something. Quality indicators are measurements or values that provide information on the effectiveness or quality of processes. They have to be measurable, well-defined, objective, and specific. Thresholds and data. A threshold value is a level of acceptable practice beyond what quality patient care cannot be measured. Exceeding this level may trigger intensive evaluation. Corrective action, preventative action. This is a CAPA plan. This is established if the data identify a problem or opportunity for improvement. The action plan defines what will change and when that change is expected. The last step in a CAPA process is an effectiveness check, where steps are taken to verify that the problem has been corrected and has not reoccurred. Processes and outcomes. Quality assurance has traditionally involved looking at outcomes. Outcomes are numbers. For example, a phlebotomy outcome measurement may give the number of times that patient's specimens were redrawn because the improper tube was used for collection in the first place. It's important to know how often this happens, but it does not explain why it happened. To improve an outcome, the process must be reviewed. This entails following the process from start to finish. Quality control. The use of checks and controls to assure quality is called quality control. Laboratory QC procedures are used to identify and correct any problems that might affect the quality of patient results. Phlebotomy QC involves using all available QC checks on every operational procedure or process to make certain it is performed correctly. Look at the key point on page 53 in your textbook. The key point states this. Students sometimes get these confused. QA and QC, quality assurance and quality control. They're often mistakenly used interchangeably to refer to processes employed to ensure the quality of a service or product. However, they are very different. Quality assurance is the program or process. Quality control is a component of the quality assurance program. So get those two straight in your mind. Quality assurance is the program or process itself, okay, and quality control is just a component of that quality assurance program. Okay, areas of phlebotomy subject to quality assurance. The first is patient preparation procedures. Quality assurance in lab testing starts in the pre-analytical. Remember, this is before the specimen is even collected. So this is pre-analytical, this is you. To obtain a quality specimen, the patient must be properly prepared. So these are some specimen collection procedures that you have to do. A phlebotomist is extremely important in this pre-analytical part. Any step in this list that is performed incorrectly can affect the quality of the specimen or the quality of care the patient will get. But the most important step, highlight that part, the very most important step is patient identification. Because remember, this is where most errors occur. What happens when this happens, the right patient doesn't get treated. So patient identification, that's your most critical. Methods to continually improve. Used to, you would write all the information down on the specimen tube, but one way that they came up with kind of preventing some errors, and then you'd get to the lab and this patient, you couldn't read maybe the phlebotomist's writing. So this is one way that errors happened. So one way they kind of corrected some of this was that they started using barcodes. Okay, the barcodes have the information already typed out on them. And so you use a barcode reader, it scans that information in before you collect the specimen, the reader's with you, and it reduces human error. Okay, also, you don't need to stop right there. Let's don't go to puncture devices yet. This is, again, kind of a rundown of what you've got to have. Remember, you got to have at least 2 patient-specific identifiers. What cannot be used? Room numbers or locations, okay? Those cannot be used as an identifier. Okay, here we go with what's a little bit tricky. For outpatients that don't have an ID band, because your inpatients all have an ID band, Most outpatients also have an ID band because they band you when you're in the outpatient setting, even if you're just there to get something drawn. But let's say they don't. The agency requires that the patient has to speak their name, and that is compared with the name on the requisition. Don't say, "Are you Shannon Goolsby?" Let's pretend that I'm hard of hearing and my phlebotomist says, "Are you Shannon Goolsby?" And I don't want to say what, and I just say yes. What if I'm not? Okay, what if your patient's hard of hearing and you don't know that, and they just say yes and they're not? Then you've misidentified them. So you don't say their name first. You say, "Can you tell me your first and last name?" Make them say it. Okay, make them speak it. Compare it with the name you have on their paper requisition. And then the patient will also provide a second verbal identifier. Say, "What is your birth date?" The whole thing. Month, day, and year. Or a phone number. Okay, some acceptable patient-specific identifiers. You need to jot these down if you don't already know them. Their name, their assigned ID number for the organization, like it may be the MedRec number on there, telephone number, date of birth, social security number, their address, and a photograph. Okay, electronic ID, like a barcode reader, this meets the standard if the technology includes 2 or more identifiers, because a barcoded wristband could be on the wrong patient. If the patient is unresponsive, which can happen in the ER, patient identifiers can be a temporary name and a medical record number or the assigned ER or emergency department number until the formal ID is confirmed, okay? Because patients can come in like that. Next, puncture devices. All puncture devices come in sealed, sterile containers and should be used only once. If the seal has been broken and you didn't do it, you need to put it in a sharps container and get a new one. Don't use it. Throw it away. Manufacturing defects in needles can also happen. So this is why you glance at a needle before you stick it in the patient. You open it up from the package, you look at the needle, you see if it has any kind of barbs, which means little metal slivers that are coming out from it, or blunt tips. Because if you inspect this needle real quickly, you're going to make sure that you don't harm the patient by sticking them with a needle that skipped through its own QC. Next, evacuated tubes. Manufacturers print expiration dates on each tube, and the lot numbers of the tubes are recorded when they're received in the lab. Usually the lab only has a limited supply, so they don't toss out tubes not used by the expiration date, so they don't have a bunch of extras. Outdated tubes should never be used because they may not fill completely, causing dilution of the sample or distortion of the cell components, and again, erroneous results. Also, anticoagulants that are in expired tubes may not work properly. They may allow small clots to form. That invalidates hematology and blood bank results. So as a part of QC, evacuated tubes should be checked occasionally for adequate vacuum and additive. Results of these and other QC checks need to be documented. Next is labeling. Labeling must be exact. Labeling requirements should be strictly followed. Computer labels normally contain correctly printed patient information. However, the correct label must be placed on the correct patient specimen. And the date, time of draw, and ID of the person collecting the sample must be noted. So every time you draw a tube on a patient, you're going to put the date, the time you drew it, and your initials, okay, so that they know and they can be able to match it up with who drew it. You also need to make sure this is labeled at the patient's bedside. Technique. Proper phlebotomy technique must be carefully taught. This is why we teach this in the class, and then this is also why you go to clinical, and there you have another phlebotomist teaching you as well as watching you do it. Because it's very, very important that you have the proper technique. You can't just stick a patient randomly because you can do nerve damage and all kinds of things. So you have to understand the process. Collection priorities. Specimen collection priorities must be stressed, okay? You have to know which specimen request is the most critical or when a specimen involves special collection criteria. That can save a patient from unnecessary medicine or even additional testing if you make sure this is done properly. It may even shorten the patient's hospital stay because therapy is based on their test values from specimens. So it's assumed that this is collected at the right time and in the proper manner. So if you're not collecting it at the right time or the proper manner, the doctor may look at the results and say, ooh, they're not better yet. They're not good enough to go home. But if it's done properly, what if those results turned out better and that patient was able to go home a day ahead? Okay, let's talk about Delta checks. Delta checks are another way to help ensure quality in testing. What a Delta check does is it compares current results of the lab test with previous results of the same test on the same patient. So let's say that your patient has been getting glucose testing done daily. Let's say that today their glucose result was 110. Okay, 70 to 110 is typically a normal, glucose result. Let's say that it flags it though because yesterday your patient was 630. Okay, it's going to flag it because that is dramatically different from yesterday's result. So what that wants you to do is check that sample. This is talking about the people in the lab, okay, the lab techs. This won't be for your part, but a Delta check is checking. This is how it's checking phlebotomy. Because if they do a Delta check in the lab and say the patient's glucose was 110 today, yesterday it was 630, it's going to flag it. That lab tech is going to pull that sample. They're going to look to make sure, is this sample properly filled? Is this sample hemolyzed? Does this sample look like it has a clot? Does it look like anything is wrong with it? If not, they are going to look at possibly getting this recollected just to check that that was the right patient. So let's say they do a recollect on this patient that's had a 630 yesterday. Let's say that a different phlebotomist goes and does the recollect. Let's say it comes back to the lab and then the result was 600. Wow, what happened? Okay, that patient was the wrong patient that was just collected. That was 110. Who was that patient? We don't know. We have no idea. Whoever the phlebotomist was that collected that 110 patient labeled it wrong. Because that poor patient that had a 630 yesterday still today only has a 600. Okay, so what if that lab tech would have let that 110 go? That would have told the doctor that that patient was better, but really that patient was not better. Okay, so Delta checks are another way to check that the phlebotomy part is correct. Again, making sure. So what's going to happen to that phlebotomist that drew the 110? That can be investigated. It depends on the lab. That can be investigated on how they are properly identifying their patients. Okay, so again, cannot stress this enough for you to make sure that you are doing your collections on the correct patients. Documentation. Documentation is critical in every area of healthcare. Medical errors that result from wrong information are sometimes deadly. Okay, so it is very, very, very important that everything is documented properly. Documentation can also be used for legal purposes. if it is legible and includes only standard abbreviations, all records are kept and they are put in this patient's chart. So let's talk about a patient record. The patient record is a chronological documentation of the medical care that was given to this patient while they're there. The law requires that medical records be kept on hospital patients, but it does not require physicians in private practice to keep such records. Most do in the form of a clinical record. Every notation in the patient's medical or clinical record must be legible, factual, and an objective account of the patient's past and present. The basic reasons for maintaining accurate, up-to-date medical records are to aid the practice of medicine and plan this patient's continued care, to provide communications between the physician and anybody else that might that's not a word, I don't guess, might in the future care for this patient. It also serves as a legal document that can be used in a court of law. And it serves as a valuable tool for helping the hospital evaluate performance outcomes. Test catalogs and reference manuals. There are searchable online menus of catalogs. There are examples of quality assurance documents that are made available to customers and blood collectors at all specimen collection sites. In an outpatient setting, like a clinic or physician office, there is the option to receive the instruction in the form of a printed reference manual. All of these documents detail how to prepare the patient and any additional information needed to collect a high-quality sample. Procedure manual. The procedure manual states the policies and procedures that apply to each test or practice performed in the lab. The procedure manual is another quality assurance document that has to be made available to all employees of the lab for standardization purposes. This CAP and Joint Commission require that this procedure manual is reviewed and updated every 2 years. I know your slide says at least annually. This means if anything changes, but it has to be reviewed for sure every 2 years. Safety manual. The safety manual contains policies and procedures related to chemical, electrical, fire, and radiation safety, exposure control, and disaster plans, as well as complete details on how to handle hazardous materials. OSHA, which I'm sure you've heard of before, stands for Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They require every business to have a workplace safety manual. Organizations can receive very high fines for not having a manual available for the employee use. If you are looking at your book on page 59, there was something, backtracking a second, on page 59, box 2-3, that gives you information that's typically found in a procedure manual. What I said was updated and reviewed by the Joint Commission and CAP. So box 2-3 gives you an example of procedure manuals, what's in those. Okay, Infection Prevention and Control Manual. In today's healthcare environment, emerging infectious diseases and drug-resistant organisms make managing all aspects of infection control more critical than ever. The Infection Prevention and Control Manual will outline these policies and procedures for every employee in all areas of the organization, and they must comply with federal regulations and accreditation requirements. It's going to address things like hand hygiene so that you don't spread one disease from one patient to the next, precautions to take when dealing with patients or handling specimens, and how to handle accidental contamination, including procedures to be implemented following exposure incidents. QA forms. Accreditation standards like the Joint Commission require lab to have all documentation on QC checks. In the phlebotomy areas, these can include temperature logs for the refrigerators and freezers where the specimens are stored, centrifuge maintenance records. This is the instrument that the specimen is spun down in, heat block temperature logs, event report forms, and incident reports. Okay, equipment check forms. In hospitals and clinics, the facilities department uses a computerized system to monitor freezers and refrigerators. Control checks on centrifuges require documentation of periodic maintenance. Internal reports. Confidential incident and occurrence reports must be filled out anytime a problem occurs. These forms identify the problem, state the consequence, and describe the corrective action. An incident report must be completed when an occupational injury or exposure, such as an accidental needle stick, has occurred, or a delayed medical condition has developed, no matter how minor. This report should be completed and submitted to the appropriate people, even if medical treatment was not required. An occurrence form is filled out for any errors made in the patient identification, specimen collection, handling, or reporting of the results. After the occurrence is documented, it is reviewed by a supervisor who decides whether counseling is required, or the process is flawed, or if anything else is needed. These reports should state facts and not feelings. The function of such a report is not to place blame, but to discover problems with the process and state the corrective action so you can prevent it from happening again. Risk management. Risk is defined as the chance of loss or injury. Risk management is an internal institution QC process that focuses on identifying and minimizing situations that pose a risk to patients and employees. Risk can be managed in two ways: by controlling risk to avoid incidences and paying for occurrences after they've happened. Generic steps in risk management involve identification of the risk, addressing the risk using policies and procedures already in place, educating employees and patients, and evaluating what should be done in the future. Individualized Quality Control Plan, or IQCP. This was eventually incorporated into the CLIA regulations. Now, instead of a one-size-fits-all approach to QC, labs have the option of developing a risk-based, objective approach to QC tailored to the testing and use, their patient population, and other aspects that may be unique to that particular lab. This allows labs to use whatever PI tools necessary to manage this risk. Sexual harassment. This is a form of sex discrimination, therefore it violates and falls under the Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Excuse me, I said Title IX. I meant Title VII. Title VII is a federal law that makes it illegal to discriminate in employment on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, or religion. Retaliation against someone who complains of sexual harassment or helps to investigate a claim is also prohibited under Title VII. This law applies to any employer with 15 or more employees. Sexual harassment is defined as persistent or offensive conduct related to a person's sex that negatively affects a reasonable person's job. It can occur in many ways, but essentially it happens when there is unwelcoming conduct of a sexual nature that is cruel or invasive and undermines morale, affects productivity, and creates a hostile work environment. Sexual harassment is not limited by gender and does not have to involve the opposite sex. The harasser could be a supervisor or superior, a co-worker, or even someone not employed in the workplace. In the healthcare field, that person could even be a patient. An employee who experiences or witnesses harassment is responsible for reporting the occurrence to the appropriate person. Direct attempt at resolution, verbally or in writing, is encouraged. It must be made clear by the recipient to the other person involved that the action was unwelcome. Documentation of the interaction or copies of the correspondence should be kept. If the actions persist, a detailed log should be kept. Next, a meeting with the supervisor to file a complaint should be scheduled. If it is uncomfortable to report to a supervisor, the department that handles such claims, typically the Human Resources Department, should be contacted. Always be aware of how you interact with patients. Don't flirt with any patient. Don't even attempt to give them the option of thinking you're flirting with them, to avoid being accused of any type of unwelcome conduct interpreted as sexual in nature. Okay, so be very aware. Legal issues. Unfortunately, litigation is common in the healthcare industry. There are many activities that could result in a lawsuit if performed without reasonable care and skill. It has been proved in past lawsuits that people performing phlebotomy can and will be held legally accountable for their actions. Most legal actions against healthcare workers are civil actions, where the alleged injured party sues for monetary damages. Willful actions by healthcare workers with the intent to produce harm or death can result in criminal charges. On Table 2.2, page 63 in your book, I want you to look at criminal and civil actions. Okay, there's definitions and punishments. Criminal are such things like felonies and misdemeanors, and the punishment a felony is a crime punishable by death or imprisonment. Misdemeanors are considered lesser offenses and usually carry a penalty of a fine or less than 1 year in jail. Civil are concerned with the actions between two private parties, and the punishment is damages may be awarded in a court of law and result in monetary penalties. Okay, the most common civil action in healthcare are based on tort law. So on your PowerPoint, you see that tort is a wrongful act other than breach of contract committed against someone's person, property, reputation, or other legally protected right for which the individual is entitled to damages awarded by the court. It is an act that is committed without a just cause and may be intentional, which is willful, or unintentional, which is accidental. Assault is the act or threat that causes another to be in fear of immediate battery or harmful touching. Battery does not necessarily have to follow an assault. However, the victim must believe that the ability to carry out the threat is there. Battery is an intentional, harmful, or offensive touching of or use of force on another person without consent or legal justification. Legal justification, for an example, would be when a mother gives permission to have blood drawn from her child. Intentional harm may range from permanent disfigurement to merely grabbing something out of another person's hand without permission. Battery is usually both a tort and a criminal offense. A phlebotomist who attempts to collect a blood specimen without getting the patient's consent can face a criminal charge of assault and battery, as well as civil suits for damages. So this is very important when you are going to draw a patient's blood, that you get their permission to draw their blood. Or if it is a child, you get parental permission or guardian permission to draw the blood. Okay, breach of confidentiality. Let's talk about that. That's on this slide. This is the failure to keep privileged information private. An example is the unauthorized release of patient information, such as lab results. This could lead to a lawsuit if it caused harm to the patient, such as the loss of their job. Patient confidentiality is protected under HIPAA. Remember the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. HIPAA violations can lead to not only personal civil lawsuits, but also fines and even the possibility of jail time. Fraud. Fraud is a deceitful practice or false portrayal of facts, either by words or by conduct. It is often done to obtain money or property. An example includes billing for services that have not been provided. I don't know if you've ever seen on the news where there's certain doctors or doctors' offices that have been filed a fraud lawsuit for, billing for things they didn't do. Invasion of privacy. This is the violation of one's right to be left alone. It can involve a physical intrusion or the unauthorized publishing or release of private information, which can also be considered a breach of confidentiality. Malpractice. This is a type of negligence committed by a professional. The training and experience of the accused individual are taken into consideration when deciding whether an act resulting in injury should be labeled negligent or malpractice. The claim of malpractice implies that a greater standard of care was owed to the injured person than the reasonable person standard associated with negligence. Negligence is the failure to exercise due care, which is also called ordinary or reasonable care, the level of care that a person of ordinary intelligence and good sense would exercise under the given circumstances. In other words, negligence is doing something that a reasonable person would not do, or not doing something that a reasonable person would do. If a medical procedure results in injury and there is no intent to injure, it is called negligence, and the injured person has the right to sue for damages. To claim negligence, the following must be present: a legal duty or obligation owed by one person to another, a breaking or breach of that duty or obligation, and harm done as a direct result of the action. Okay, res ipsa loquitur, which is on the right-hand column, this means obvious negligence. Okay, it's a Latin phrase meaning the thing speaks for itself, which applies to the rule of evidence in a case of negligence. When a breach of duty is so obvious that it does not need explanation, it is said that the situation speaks for itself. For example, a patient is injured by an uncapped phlebotomy needle that somehow became wedged between the cushion and the side of a phlebotomy chair. So let's say the next patient sat down and got stuck by that. The needle obviously caused the injury, but it cannot be proved who was responsible for the needle ending up in the cushion. Okay, respondeat superior, this is employer liability. Okay, it's a Latin phrase that means let the master respond. An employer is liable, legally responsible, for the actions of an employee, even though the employee is the one at fault. So a tort action may be filed if an employee's neglectful or intentional act results in some type of physical injury to a client. This means that the employee is working within the scope of employment and has had the proper training to perform the required duties. If a neglectful act occurs while an employee is doing something that is not within their duties or training, the employee may be held solely responsible for that act. Okay, so if they're doing something that they're not trained to do, if you're doing something you're not trained to do. Standard of care. This is the normal level of skill and care that a healthcare worker would be expected to adhere to in order to provide due care for their patients. Failure to exercise due care is negligence. Employers are responsible for having employees who possess qualifications and training necessary to meet the standard of care, and ultimately they are liable if they do not. Statute of limitations. This is a law that is setting the length of time after an alleged injury during which the injured person is permitted to file a lawsuit. The time limit is specified in each state's medical malpractice law. The question for all parties involved is, when does the clock start? The statute of limitations period typically begins the day the alleged negligent act was committed, when the injury that results in negligence was discovered or should have been discovered, the day the physician-patient relationship ended, or the day of the last medical treatment in a series. In the case of minors, often not until the minor reaches the age of majority. And just to give you another heads up, age of majority is not the age of 18 like the legal age you would think in every single state. Some states it's 19, some's 21. So anyway, the age of majority is different in different areas. We'll talk about that more in depth later. Vicarious liability, the last one. Liability imposed by law on one person for acts committed by another. One example is employer liability under respondeat superior. That was explained earlier. Another example is employer liability for negligence by an independent contractor or consultant who was hired. This is based on the principle that the contractor or consultant is acting on behalf of the employer because of the contract between them. Malpractice insurance. This compensates the insured in the event of malpractice liability. As a phlebotomy student, when you started this program, you had to purchase, and it was in your fees, however much it cost, malpractice insurance. It's student malpractice insurance. Individual workers are not typically targets of lawsuits because of respondeat superior or vicarious liability, which involve the deep pockets theory. This means the one with the most money pays. So do you think the hospital or you are going to have more money? The hospital, okay? So who are they going to go after? They can, however, be named as co-defendants, in which case the employer's malpractice insurance may not cover them. It's important for healthcare people to examine the possibility of a civil suit being brought against them and consider carrying their own malpractice insurance. The decision to purchase this insurance should be based on financial considerations as well as legal ones. From the legal point of view, it may be desirable to be covered by a separate professional liability policy because the employer may give its insurer the right to recover damages from an employee who is found to be negligent. Healthcare personnel may be able to purchase malpractice insurance from their professional organizations. Avoiding lawsuits. The best insurance against lawsuits is to take the steps to avoid them. A good way to avoid lawsuits is to consistently follow the guidelines that are on page 66, box 2-4. I'm going to go over these because they are extremely important. Some of them are listed on this slide, but not all of them. The others go on to the next page. Okay, so they're listed in 2 slides in a row. Acquire informed consent before collecting specimens. Meticulously identify your patients and your specimens. Number 3, carefully monitor patient during and after venipuncture. Make sure they don't walk down the hall and fall out, after they leave you. Respect a patient's right to confidentiality. Number 5, strictly adhere to accepted procedures and practices. Next slide. Number 6, use proper safety containers and devices. Number 7, listen and respond appropriately to the patient request. Number 8, accurately and legibly record all patient information. Number 9, document incidents or occurrences. Number 10, participate in continuing education to maintain proficiency. Make sure you're hip on all the new things. Number 11, perform at prevailing standard of care. Number 12, never perform procedures you are not trained to do. Informed consent. Okay, this implies voluntary and competent permission for a medical procedure, test, or medication. It requires that a patient be given adequate information regarding the method, risk, and consequences of a procedure before they consent to it. The information must be given to the patient in non-technical terms and in their own language, if possible, meaning that an interpreter may be necessary if the patient does not speak your language. By law, informed consent for research purposes has to have a signed consent document. Expressed consent. This is a variation of informed consent. It is required for treatment that involves surgery, experimental drugs, genetic testing, or high-risk procedures. Consent should cover what procedures will be performed and should not be in a general form that allows the physicians full authority to do whatever they want to do. Consent may be given verbally or in writing. Written consent gives the best possible protection for both the treatment provider and the patient because it must be signed by both and witnessed by a third party. Verbal consent for treatment should be followed by an entry in the patient's chart covering what was discussed with the patient. Implied consent. The patient's actions or circumstances imply consent without a verbal or written expression of consent. This type of consent may be necessary in emergency procedures, such as CPR, to save a person's life. That patient's not going to be able to give you consent, okay? But you've got to save their life, you've got to perform the CPR. Laws involving implied consent are enacted at the state level and differ greatly from state to state. HIV consent. Legislation governing informed consent for HIV tests has been enacted in most states. The laws specify exactly what type of information must be given to inform the client properly. Typically, the client must be advised concerning the test and its purpose, how the test might be used, and the meaning of the test and its limitations. Backing up just a second on implied consent, if a phlebotomist tells a patient they're going to collect a blood specimen and your patient just holds out their arm but they don't say anything, if you say, hey, I'm Shannon from the lab, I'm here to draw your blood, and they flop their arm open because they've had their blood drawn numerous times and they know what that means, that is considered implied consent. Okay? So they don't have to verbally say okay. If they flop their arm out, that's giving you permission. Okay? I needed to state that. That is an example of implied consent. Consent for minors. As a general rule, a minor cannot give consent for the administration of medical treatment. Parental or guardian consent is required. Anybody that violates this rule is liable for assault and battery. A minor, remember, is not just somebody that's 18, under 18. It is called the age of majority, okay? And that's determined by law. The age of majority is recognized legally as an adult in the healthcare setting. The age of majority in the United States is 18 years of age in most states, but it's 19 years of age in several states, 21 years in one state, and then it's the age upon high school graduation in 6 states. So if any question asks you, the definition of a minor is who? All you have to say is not the age of majority, okay? Because it's different everywhere. You can't say less than 18, less than 21. It's not the age of majority. The definition of a minor is anyone who is not the age of majority. Okay, refusal of consent. An individual has a constitutional right to refuse a medical procedure, including venipuncture. The refusal may be based on religious or personal beliefs and preferences. A patient who refuses medical treatment is normally required to verify the refusal in writing on a special form. So they can tell you no. Litigation process. Litigation is the process used to settle legal disputes. About 10% of malpractice lawsuits go to court. The rest are settled out of court. There are 2 phases. Phase 1 begins when an alleged patient incident occurs or the patient becomes aware of a prior possible injury. Phase 2 is when the injured party or a family member consults with an attorney. The attorney requests, obtains, and reviews copies of the medical records and decides whether to take the case. If the attorney thinks that malpractice has occurred and takes the case, an attempt to negotiate a settlement is then made. If it's not resolved by negotiation, a complaint is filed by the patient's attorney. Once a complaint is filed, the injured party becomes the plaintiff, and the person against whom the complaint is filed becomes the defendant. Both sides now conduct formal discovery, which is a process where both sides exchange information about witnesses and evidence that will be presented at the trial. Discovery typically involves depositions and submitting written questions called interrogations that must be answered by the other party in writing. Giving a deposition is a process in which one party questions another under oath while a court reporter records every word. Phase 3 is where the trial phase is. Both sides present their versions of the facts and the jury determines which version appears to be correct. If the jury decides in the plaintiff's favor, damages may be awarded. At this point, the lawsuit may proceed to Phase 4. Phase 4 begins with an appeal of the jury's decision. Although either side has the right to an appeal, the losing party is usually the one to choose this option. I don't know why the winning party would ever appeal their win. These are the NACLS entry-level competencies that were met in this chapter. You can just kind of look over those. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me or send a message through Canvas. This completes Chapter 2, Quality Assurance and Legal Issues in Healthcare. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you next time.